Gavet has just published a book called Trampled by Unicorns, Big Tech's Empathy Problem and How to Fix It, which really I do think picks up on a number of John's last points quite effectively. She's been thinking about this question for a long time. And the reason she's thought about it is because she is herself a practitioner. She was at Techonomy, I believe it was in 2013, Maelle, on our stage when she was CEO of a company called Ozone.ru, which was the Amazon of Russia. She happens to be French. Prior to that, she had been at Boston Consulting Group as a consultant for a long time, went into tech, ran this e-commerce company in Russia, later worked has had a number of senior jobs at Booking.com, and most recently at Compass.com, where she was also a senior executive, a real estate company, major tech real estate company. Maelle, I want to ask you, given that you are a practitioner, essentially part of Silicon Valley, even though you've actually been outside of that bubble for most of the time, what motivated you to write a book about the empathy problem of tech?
First, very happy to be here. Happy Tuesday, everyone. It's always amazing to see so many people who have the energy to get together. So I've been, as you mentioned, I've been in tech for now 15 years-ish. And for a large chunk of that, have been making people around me sick and tired of hearing me say, we can't build a great tech company by focusing just on great product. We have to start by focusing on the people. Like, we need to have great people who care about other people, and then these great people are going to be the one going and building the great product. And that very quickly led to this whole conversation about empathy and the fact that we needed to have companies, particularly in tech, that really cared about the impact of their decision, not just on their employees, not just on their customers, but in general on local community and society at large. And so fundamentally what happened is that I wanted to write a book that's solved or tried to solve two issues. The first one is I wanted to paint an exhaustive and balanced picture of the impact of big tech on the world, on humanity, what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because I found that too often the books and the media articles that I was reading were just too one-sided. It was either like tech is amazing, don't you dare criticizing it, or it was the exact opposite, which is it's absolutely horrible, like the end of the world is closed because of this company. And I wanted to explain, probably because a lot of these people are my friends, I wanted to explain why, because of this deficit of empathy at the core of the tech ecosystem, we are finding ourselves at a crossroad where the negative is starting to outweigh the positive. It doesn't mean that the positive doesn't exist. So that was one goal. And then the other goal was to actually offer solutions, because again, reading these books or these articles, I was getting incredibly frustrated about and so what? Like, okay, so we all agree it's not perfect, like, but so what do we do? And so I wanted to have at least half of the book talking about what can each stakeholder, starting with the big tech company themselves. I'm a capitalist at heart. I believe that like it starts with the company, but then also going with the investors, the media, the users, and yes, the regulators too, because I believe that governments have a key role to play in finding these solutions.
Yeah, and by the way, it's a fantastic book. I've been recommending it right and left, and it's not too hard to read. It's full of incredible information, and it brings together a lot of things that have been talked about many places, but in a very coherent manner. So it's a well-written book for a practitioner. So let me give you credit for that. But why don't you talk a little bit about what some of the problems are that have emerged because of the lack of empathy? I mean, what are the things you most worry about when you look at tech right now?
Many things. I'm going to start by saying that I'm also an optimist, and I believe that humanity has proven over and over again that when we identify a problem, we are an unbelievable species when it comes to solve these problems, like better than any other species. So I do believe that these conversations that we're starting to have more and more in the open with the media and with the regulators are actually moving the needle, because we're finally surfacing a lot of trade-offs that have been made, I'm gonna say mainly behind the scenes, by tech companies, and I'm excited that we finally are talking about that, and that the media is reporting on it. Now, in terms of problems, unfortunately, quite a few. I think I try to be as exhaustive as I can in the book. It starts with very well-known problem around misinformation. I mean, we just talk about coronavirus and the way American people are dealing or feeling about this pandemic. I mean, Facebook and YouTube have been primary source of misinformation. And there are, again, I talk about it in my book, like tons of statistics that show that they have made the problem way worse. So that's one huge issue. And I think as we're getting into a more polarized world, I believe that the next Cold War is actually going to happen on the consumer internet. And so we're going to have more and more of this misinformation, and we're going to need to have more and more debate about how we handle that. So that's one huge pocket. I think there's another massive pocket, which, by the way, is related to that first one, is the question of data ownership and privacy. And I'm not just talking about Facebook and YouTube. I'm also talking about all the other companies, from the travel companies, some of which I have actually worked for, which have a tremendous amount of data, all the way to Amazon and others that you're using on a pretty regular basis. So this question of where does your privacy end is a really, really important one. And again, I can keep going. We can talk about the impact it has on labor law and what the gig economy means for the future of workers in the world. We can talk about taxation and the fact that big tech has historically paid significantly less tax, legally, but still significantly less tax than any other S&P 500 company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'm looking at the results of the poll, which I'm going to share in a second, and it may help focus a little bit on some of these issues. But when you say the next Cold War is going to happen on these platforms, what does that mean exactly?
So I think when historically, when we, and I say we, but I don't really include myself into it, too young for that. When we created the internet, we had this amazing vision of a border-free internet, something that a new digital platform that would allow everyone to exchange knowledge and to communicate with each other, and we could work from everywhere we wanted, and that would be amazing. And there's a lot of things in the way the internet was actually built, like on a physical basis, that reflect that ideal. But now if we look at what is currently happening, be India banning Chinese app, be Russia quite some time ago, actually when I was CEO of Ozone, the e-commerce company you were talking about, that was the prime time when the Russian government was starting to say, hey, we want the data of Russian citizens to be stored on Russian soil. And that, by the way, was then replicated and amplified by other countries. And so we've started seeing governments be like, oh, wait a minute, actually, there's my citizens are actually on the net. They're doing a lot of things that may at first sight look like benign and not that important, but it is actually a matter of security, of national security, to know how are these data being used, who is tracking who is, and we're back to the misinformation thing, who is pushing in what kind of information to my citizens. And so what I mean by that is I think we're very clearly, especially over the last 12 to 24 months, we're seeing the end of this borderless internet, of this consumer internet that didn't really matter because it's just, it's just e-commerce or it's just ride sharing. And we're starting to see government being way more careful about the nationality of this company, where do they store the data, what can they do with it, what kind of content, et cetera, et cetera.
So literally a Cold War in a sense, because let me share the data and I'll tell you where I was coming from in the question a little bit. Okay, so here are the results. If you see, basically this group thinks that the companies are doing middling when it comes to ethical and moral behavior. Less than, I guess you'd average that around 35, 40%-ish. 2.4 out of 5 maybe. But look at this, the second question: which American tech company most needs reform? boy, there is a pretty clear consensus on this one. That Facebook is at 97, not only two people here didn't say Facebook needed to be reformed.
Please
That
raise
is
your
pretty
hand if you were these two people. I want to
yeah,
talk to
really.
you.
You want to talk to them afterward. Well, that's what I was going to get at. And of course, Google is not, it's pretty far behind, but it's the next one. I mean, Amazon is second, and Google is in the same ballpark. Interestingly, nobody cares about Netflix. Apple seems to be let off the hook. Microsoft, we'll get to that, maybe, probably not a ton. But here, are we confident the US government will find a way to regulate and reform these companies? Not very likely. That's the opinion of this group. So I guess what I really wanted to do is hone in on Facebook, since everyone is so mad at it. And you said something quite striking to me when we were on the phone prepping for this. But I guess when you said the Cold War, I wondered if you were thinking that the next Cold War may be between two factions in society and not between countries, right? It's a global Cold War, you could say, between those people who believe in facts and those people who believe in conspiracy. That seems to be kind of the overall, one of the ways of defining it. But what do you think about how Facebook is causing society to change right now?
I think in general, and by the way, so the poll is very aligned with some of the conversation I've had with a lot of people. The only reason, in my view, why Google doesn't rank as high as Facebook is because a lot of people don't think about YouTube as belonging to Google. And I'd be very curious if we were to ask the exact same question and split Google, meaning the search engine, from YouTube, how YouTube would score, because in my view, YouTube and Facebook are pretty much in the exact same bucket. And if anything, YouTube has been given a lot of leeway because the media don't put as much pressure and as much attention on YouTube. Now, in terms of the impact of Facebook on society, I think, look, Facebook started with this beautiful idea of connecting the world, and really deeply believe, I'm a friend with a lot of people at Facebook still, really deeply believe that by exchanging information, the world would genuinely be a better place. Now they have a problem, which is their model requires for them to have as many people staying as long as possible. And they very quickly, and I'm sure most of you listening to us today know about that, they very quickly discovered that the best way for us to stay on Facebook as long as possible is to create violent emotions, mainly negative ones, because the positive ones somehow we get very used to it. The negative one are the one that we feel very engaged with. And so Facebook created a culture of outrage. And an algorithm that push content in front of us based basically on whether or not it's going to be outrageous enough for us to want to like it, share it, comment on it. And so at the fundament, at the core of Facebook is this big problem, which is they want to do good, but the algorithm is built to spread misinformation, lies, and outrageous information, because this is what's going to make us come back over and over again. It's like drug, like it's just drug in our system.
Okay, so we're not loaded with time. We've got about 5 more minutes, but I'm going to possibly unfairly quote something you said to me on the prep call, where you said you believe Facebook is destroying Western democracy, which is maybe slight exaggeration, but I don't think you said it ironically.
No.
So let's cut right to the chase. You're saying they don't want to do this, but how will they be able to make a transition? Let's look at them particularly and bring empathy into their approach to the world. Can they do it on their own? And how would they do it?
I think realistically, self-regulation has never worked for any industry. And so let's not put the bar higher on the tech industry than on any others. Like, there's very smart people, but there's no reason why they would be able to self-regulate more than other industries. So the direct answer to your question is no, they're not going to be able to do it on their own, but we shouldn't like guilt trip them for that. Like, again, every other company out there at some point needed the regulator to remind them that this is the guardrail that they need to operate in. And I think the regulator hasn't put this guardrail in place for a really long time for tech companies in general and for Facebook in particular. Now, this does not mean in any way that we should expect the regulator to do everything. First, because as the poll underlined, there's a serious amount of doubt that the regulator is actually, especially in the US, is actually going to be able to do something. I'm much more hopeful about what the European Union is doing in that area. But also because fundamentally Western societies have been built on this balance between this entrepreneurial capitalism that we all know and like, because this is where our standards of living are improving and innovation is coming from. And so a balance between that and governments which are not supposed to run companies, but are supposed to defend values and standards of living and things that we really believe in, and that we democratically elected them to do that. And so I believe that Facebook can do stuff, like they can decide to stop political ads forever. They can decide to like really put more team, more efforts, more resources around vetting any paid content. They're not doing a really good job at it. They can do a lot more around stopping the monetization of false information. Right now, honestly, they're still tiptoeing around that. A lot of the reason why you keep seeing so much horrible content is because there are people who make a fortune out of it. We can talk about anonymity, etc. I mean, like the list is super long. And so when you hear a Facebook executive tell you, oh, this is so hard, we're trying, but like the problem is hard, it's like, you're not trying hard enough, because there's at least 20 other things that you could be doing and that you're not doing.
Well, I think one could easily argue the reason they're not doing it is because of Wall Street and their need to keep showing growth and profitability. And many of the remedies that you and I would both agree, and most of us here would agree, need to be implemented, would result in less profit. So, I mean, it sounds to me sort of in summary, and I have read the book, but in summary, you don't really have a lot of hope for the biggest tech platforms, that in a way, the market is going to solve that because somehow they're going to self-destruct long-term. But the argument of incorporating empathy into tech is more about the next generation of companies and how they can be created to avoid harming society the way this past generation did. Is that a reasonable summary?
It's fairly reasonable. I believe like my hope is really in the next generation of entrepreneurs, like the one who are currently working on building the next Facebook, the next Google, etc. Having said that, if you look at a company like Microsoft under Satya, they've done a pretty phenomenal job at becoming more empathetic under his leadership. And he's a leader who is not afraid of saying that he wants a more empathetic company. If you look at what Mark Benioff has been doing with Salesforce for quite a long time, I think it's not perfect, but it's actually pretty good. And so I think the way I would divide it is I think there are companies whose business model requires some tweaks and like a little more efforts from the leadership, but it's possible. And so I think companies like Apple, for example, or even Amazon could potentially like go into this more empathetic way of thinking. I think for some others, Facebook and YouTube being very likely the primary candidate to that group, it's going to be a lot harder, because being more empathetic, being more human-centered would require such a fundamental over or restructuring of their business model that I don't know, especially as their public company, I don't know if their shareholders are going to allow them to do that. And I don't know if their CEOs, especially in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know if he actually understands how critical that is.
No, he does not understand that. I would tell you he does not understand it, in my opinion. But so let's just, final question. The power of government and how it's going to be implemented. You are European. Your continent, we should say, has done a much better job than our part of our continent, I'd say. And your continent has, in effect, led the world in setting some examples of how this pushback could occur. What do you predict in the next, say, 2 or 3 years will happen with governments and the big tech platforms? And unfortunately, this has to be the last question.
Yeah, I think governments, because they understand that it's again, a national security concern increasingly. They understand that they're having taxation issue. Like all the governments around the world need more money, and the COVID crisis has made it even worse. And who are the companies that are making the most money right now? It's big tech. And then the media and citizens in general are putting more and more pressure around like the social responsibility of these companies. I think governments are going to step up. Now, in the US specifically, the big question is whether the upcoming government, given the structure of the Congress and the Senate, is actually going to be able to do much regarding that specific topic. I think Europe has the advantage from just a structural perspective that we can move faster on some of this topic because there's less bipartisan debates around these questions.
Well, I wish we had more time. You're really fascinating when you said that Section 230 could never be implemented, and the need for diversity to move these companies towards empathy. I think that's something everybody here can pretty quickly understand. If the companies were led by more diverse teams, they'd be more empathetic and they might not have made some of these mistakes. I just recommend, again, everybody should read this book. It is really an important book, and I'm very eager to see what you do next, Maelle, because you've set a high standard for yourself in this industry. So
Yes.
thank you so much for being here, and we'll come back to you again soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.